The following stories are all paranormal in nature. 1. I am a strong believer in the paranormal. Even though I am only 13, I have many stories like this. So for some background. My family always takes an annual trip to San Francisco every year. This year, however, we made some rather bad decisions on where to camp. We decided to stay in a hostel. For those of you who don't know what a hostel is, it's kind of like a hotel, but less expensive and better. This hostel, however, was an old military hospital. Like I said, I'm a very firm believer that the paranormal exists. We ate dinner, and then we went over to the game room, which is underground in the basement. Big mistake number 1. After about 30 minutes, my parents told us that they were going to go to the room and play some games. They left me and my little sister alone in a basement at 11 o'clock at night in an old military hospital where many had died and spirits still lurked. Anyways, me and my sister stayed and played some pool. Everyone else in the hostel was asleep at this point, and we were starting to get a weird feeling. Like we were being watched. I ignored the feeling until I began to feel breathing on my neck. I snapped my neck around to see what the hell was breathing on me. I turned to see my sister laughing. I told her it wasn't funny. She had really scared me. So as you can imagine, I was even more unnerved at this point. It was about midnight and I began to get tired. My sister kept nagging for just one more game. I agreed. This was a huge mistake. If I had known what was going to happen, I would have just sprinted the hell away. But I didn't. This is where shit gets weird. About 5 minutes after we started the game, I started to feel like I was being watched again. I told my sister and she just laughed. All of a sudden, pool balls began to be thrown at me. It was like a professional pitcher was pitching at the World Series finally. They were being thrown hard. The weird thing is, my sister didn't see any of this. She just saw me standing there with my eyes wide open. But I swear to God, I was under attack by pool balls. After I had dodged them all, I quickly sprinted back to the room, with my sister right behind me shouting, "Are you okay? What happened to you?" All the while she was laughing. I never told my parents about this. Before you blame this on drugs, keep in mind that I am 13. And I am pretty sheltered. I was not on drugs. I have never told anyone what happened except for my best friend, for I feared they would bring me to a mental asylum. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have had any similar experiences. Also check out my YouTube channel, which is called Sub-Zero2121. 2. I joined a cast to perform a play. The cast was small, and when you have a small cast, there is a lot of bonding. One of my castmates, whom I'll call Kay, asked me, "As a Wiccan, have you ever done a cleansing?" Of course I had, all the time, especially to my own home. So I told her as much, followed with, "Why do you ask?" She proceeded to tell me that she had an entity in her home that was causing her and her family issues, to the point of making her physically ill. Nauseous. We talked more about what was going on in her home. She told me that the home had burned down and that a new home was rebuilt on the same foundation. We set up a day and a time for me to come over. From what she told me, a simple sage cleansing wasn't going to be enough. There is a herb called asafoetida. I don't know how else to describe it except to say this stuff smells like ass. I made a blend of asafoetida and sage and some other herbs and oils. On the scheduled day, I went to her house. You know that uneasy feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when something is wrong? That was what I felt. I conducted my self-protection before I went in. I set up in the kitchen, said the opening blessing, and proceeded with the entire home cleansing ritual by sparking up the incense mixture. We went from room to room reciting, basically, "Only good can come here, because only good comes from here." Discord, disorder must leave. Everything was going smoothly, nothing unusual, until we got to one of the rooms. My incense mixture went out. I kept reciting the ritual I had written when, I shit you not, the incense went off. It was like crazy, like a smoke bomb. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, because I was. But we kept going. The last room was the kitchen where we started. Remember, I had set up in the kitchen. I didn't start the cleansing there. I recited the ritual. I got about halfway through when a scream went through the kitchen. It was over our heads and around us. I had Kay open a window and let it out. Once she closed the window, everything was calm and quiet. Once the plate closed, I didn't see Kay much. I did keep in touch with her to follow up and ensure everything was okay. It was for a while. But within a month, Kay was posting pictures of herself that were blurred and fuzzy. It was never the house. It was Kay who had the attachment. I also realized that she actually enjoyed the attachment as she didn't want to get rid of it. After this experience, I'm finding there are many others like Kay. They have negative attachments, and even though there are ways to get rid of them, they don't want to. In a way, it's like martyrdom. Like a burden they just have to carry for others. Should they get rid of this? Hell yes. But you can't force an adult to get rid of a negative attachment. It has to be of their own volition. 3. I have had a lot of strange experiences in my house growing up, and I thought I would share a few. The house I grew up in was built in the 50s, and was a model for the neighborhood that would eventually build up around it. My mother actually grew up in the house first, and eventually purchased it from my grandparents, which has kept the house in the family for almost 50 years. And counting. I spent quite a bit of time alone in the house growing up, with a strong sense that I was never quite alone. But it never really bothered me. That is, unless I had to go downstairs. Without fail, that would change the feeling in the house entirely. It's always cold down there and foreboding. It caused a sense of dread when you had to go downstairs, and I get chills just thinking about it. You'd imagine with that description that it's unfinished, but it's actually quite nice. It has a large family room with a TV and fireplace, along with a finished bathroom, computer room, bedroom, separate laundry room, and a large storage room. The storage room was the worst part of the basement, and hands down the place I liked the least. Its door, which was a sliding wooden door, much like all the other rooms in the basement, was also directly next to the TV and always left a horrible, uneasy feeling when I watched TV downstairs as a child. Anyhow, going downstairs was always a bit of a process. I would slowly descend the stairs, peek around the wall into the family room to make sure the coast was clear, then bolt for the light switch. Going back upstairs, now that was even worse. Every single time I would have to switch the lights off, lest I get in trouble with my father and, God forbid, sent back down to turn them off. And bolt up the stairs like my ass was on fire, and a bucket of water awaited at the top. I have never once ran up there without the sense that I am being chased by something, and was losing the race. Growing up, I would hear noises and even voices downstairs. While home alone, I would hear people running upstairs, which would prompt me into thinking that someone had come home, only to find that I was still alone. I would be called downstairs from what sounded like my mother, only to discover no one was there when I went down. It wasn't unusual for the lights to be off when peering downstairs, as my father was crazy about wasting power, and my mother only used the ones she absolutely needed, which would only include the ones inside the laundry room, Its door was under the stairs, meaning that I would never know if the call from my mother was legit or not until I would go downstairs, slide open its door and discover that the laundry room light was off, and that I was the only one home. Then, shortly after, realizing that I was standing in my basement alone in the dark. This happened often, and never got less gut-wrenchingly scary when it did. For a period of time while this was going on, I would have these dreams where I was downstairs doing what I always did in the basement, playing video games, watching TV, etc. But there would be a lady in a white dress of sorts, standing there watching me. I would look to my right, and she was there in the distance, standing still and arms down in front of her, watching. I would turn my head to the left and everything was just as it should be, except she would again be in the distance, by the far wall, standing and watching. Sometimes I would look all around me just to see if she would still be there, but turn again to find her sitting next to me, body straight, but head and stare fixed right on me. That is when I would immediately burst up awake, drenched in sweat. The unused spare bedroom downstairs also had a walk-in closet, housing old military uniforms and other jackets and clothing that were preserved in plastic covers. Sometimes, as a child, friends and I would play hide-and-go-seek down there, and that would be my favorite hiding spot, since one could remain among the clothes even when someone was actively looking right in your direction. The clothes made a very distinctive sound when touched or moved, and nothing else in the house sounded like it. As I got older and the weird basement activities began to intensify, I would often hear that noise before making my mad dash upstairs. The light switch for the family room is right outside the doorway to the bedroom, and when I would approach it to go upstairs, I would hear that rustling as if something was emerging from the closet. Seeing that I had a view of the open doorway into the pitch-black room from the light switch, this caused me to have to flip and bolt up the stairs for dear life, even quicker than normal. Like I mentioned, the activity in the basement ramped up as I got older. My then girlfriend, let's call her Lynn, and I would hang out downstairs, constantly, to avoid my parents. It was basically our own space, for better or worse. One day we finished watching a movie and she went to use the bathroom. While she was in there, I had to check something on my computer, which was up in my bedroom. Without thinking, I ran upstairs to quickly check it out. Then moments later, came back downstairs. She was out of the bathroom and was looking at me with what she calls her skeptical eyes. I asked her what was up and she said, "Very funny." I was confused and asked what she was talking about. She explained that I had run up and down the stairs really quickly, then opened the storage room door and dragged something heavy out and in front of the bathroom door to scare her. I didn't know what to say. I tried to tell her that I just ran upstairs to check my computer, and that I hadn't been downstairs at all, but she didn't believe me. Luckily, I had typed a few messages on AIM while upstairs, and was able to show her the chat log times, which proved my point, but then at the same time freaked her out. She also realized that she never heard whatever was dragged in front of the door actually be dragged back to where it came from, which scared her even further. This happened to her several more times over the period of a few weeks. I could go on and on, but I'll end with this final story. Though I have dozens of stories I could write about, this is one that really sticks out in my mind as a major event. A few years later, Lynn and I were now married, and we were asked to dog sit for my mother and father while they went on vacation. My parents had 2 Shih Tzus, which they gated off to remain in the kitchen. Lynn and I decided we would just stay over for the few days, as my parents' house was, in a way, a small vacation for us as well. One night, like the beginning of a cliché horror movie, It began vigorously storming outside. The dark house would completely illuminate from the bright lightning flashes, only to then shake from the tremendously loud thunder just seconds later. The two dogs loved thunderstorms and never barked or freaked out. If anything, it likely helped them sleep, as I could never wake them to use the bathroom if one was in the area. Around midnight, as my wife and I laid in bed with the TV and lights off so we can go to sleep, I thought I heard footsteps on the stairs, but chalked it up to the storm. Shortly after, I heard the sliding door at the top of the stairs, which I had locked, and could only be locked from the inside, slide open, and the dogs suddenly started going crazy. I had never heard them bark like this in my entire life. I threw off my covers and told Lynn I am going to check on them. That's when we heard it, above the sound of the rain and their barking. We both suddenly hear a woman who sounds exactly like my mother speaking to them. I couldn't quite make out exactly what was being said, but I could tell it was in a very similar consoling tone that my mother would do if they were scared about something. I wondered for a moment if my parents had actually come home early, but quickly realized that I would have been notified, seen the car pull up, or heck, heard both back doors open, and then of course a struggle with the one-way lock on the sliding door. Not only that, the dogs would have been thrilled to see them, which was an entirely different bark. No, this was terror. They snarled, yelped, and vigorously barked over and over, while the familiar voice of my mother was still speaking. I told Lynn I had to investigate in case it was an intruder, but deep down we both knew what we were dealing with. I crept out of bed, my sounds masked by the chaos happening both outside and inside the house. The door to the room led to the hallway, which was shaped like an L, and exiting the room would put you at the bottom of that shape. In other words, the end of the smaller line of an L letter shape, if that makes sense. Against Lynn's pleading, I crept out of the door and into the hallway. The walls leading from the bend in the hall to the room are lined with full-body mirrors, which nearly gave me a heart attack when lightning suddenly illuminated the hallway, revealing my reflection standing directly next to me. Needless to say, we both looked shocked to be there. I regrouped, shot Lynn the "you didn't see that" look, and got back to the task. I peered my head around the corner and saw both dogs with their backs pressed up against the gate, both looking up at something that was just behind the wall to the right and out of sight. I stood there, wondering what to do. Part of me wanted to just lock myself in the room with Lynn, and the other half wanted to say, fuck it, and just rush into the kitchen and deal with whatever I would find. I had spent my life rushing upstairs away from unseen fears in my house, and frankly, I wasn't a kid anymore, and I was tired of that shit. I glanced at Lynn again, then decided I was going in. I bolted towards the kitchen at full speed. I reached the gate in time to see both dogs instantly stop barking. The voice stopped, and both their heads just turned to look at me. I whipped the upper half of my body over the gate to peer into the kitchen, only to see it empty. I glanced down at them, and they are both suddenly calm but sitting in puddles of their own pee. Accidents of that nature never happened, so that was further confirmation to me that something was definitely wrong. I hop over the gate and walk to the sliding door at the opposite end of the kitchen, which was now unlocked and opened. The back door was still locked from the inside and closed like I left it. But despite it being 80 degrees outside and summer, the area in front of the back door was absolutely freezing. I glanced downstairs and it was beyond pitch black, and didn't seem to illuminate like the rest of the house did from the flashes of lightning. I had enough adrenaline at this point to just bolt downstairs into the darkness and confront my childhood tormentor head on. And oddly enough, I was damned tempted to do so. Rational thought kicked in, however, and I closed the sliding door and tended to the dogs, spending the next hour or so giving them a bath and cleaning the floor. Lynn donned her "you're a fucking idiot for doing that" eyes, but I actually felt good about it. I'm over that bitch and her tricks. Several weeks later, when my parents' vacation was over, I was visiting their house and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, which is right across from the sliding door to the basement stairs. I decided to sit down and tell her what happened that night we were watching the dogs. I mentioned the stairs and the strange woman's voice, and she went completely pale and froze. She explained that as a child, she would hear a voice that sounded very close to her aunt, which would trick her into coming down into the basement, though it would always be dark and empty. This was interesting, but I must note that her aunt was and still is alive to this day. She too was scared to go into the basement as a child because of this, and shared the sense of being chased up the stairs, even to this day. She also said, even recently, that while sitting alone at the table, she would sometimes hear someone stomp up the stairs at an inhuman speed, stop at the sliding door, but never open it. The dogs hear it as well, and they are not fans of this. So far to this day, I don't quite know what roams the house and why it does it. I just know that it's a woman, or that it can make itself sound like one. It's apparently a bit on the shy side when it comes to actually being seen, but I'm okay with that. I now take my sweet time going up the stairs though. I still get the sensation that I should be running for my life. 4. This story, in addition to story number 3, was originally posted on Reddit by user ThoughtTMusic. When I was a kid, a very popular pastime at my house was to play hide and go seek in my basement. The thrill of hiding, combined with the basement's general creep factor, made for an invigorating game. As I explained in my previous post, there were certain rooms in my basement that I made a point to avoid at all times, and the storage room was at the top of that list. My basement in general is a place of extreme creepiness and, in short, is haunted by a woman, or at least something that portrays itself as a woman. Bottom line, she plagued my childhood with constant terror and trickery. Anyways, that day, I experienced game after game of being found quicker than others, and I was getting frustrated. The idea popped in my head to surprise everyone by hiding in the one place they would never think to look for me: the storage room. I was pretty uneasy about this decision, as it went against everything I believed. But my desire to win outmatched the logic centers of my brain. The storage room was a dark and dank place that consisted of a giant square shelf in the middle of the room, with a path carved out around it. It was filled with items ranging from Christmas lawn elves, Halloween decorations, china, tools, dressers, etc. So even with the lights turned on, there was plenty of creepy things staring back at you the entire time you were in there. It was my friend Kay's turn to start counting, and I was giddy with excitement to win. She started counting down from 20, and I bolted towards one of my common rooms, but lagged slightly behind everyone else so I could divert to the storage room at the very last second, to conceal my plan from my friends. Last thing I needed was to be ratted out after my other friends were caught. I was in it to win it. I slid open the storage room door, turned on the lights, and closed the door behind me. It was cold and damp, which was the norm for this room, but nothing I couldn't handle. Since I was already out of time at this point, I had to make a quick decision on where to hide. So I ducked down behind a piece of luggage that barely concealed me. This was not ideal, and there were definitely more complex paths through the stored items that I could hide in. But I already heard someone outside the door, and didn't have time to search for a better option. I see Kay slide open the door and come into the room to look around. I figured I must have made too much noise when closing the doors, so she knew I was in here. She was rubbing her shoulders, highlighting the temperature difference from the other rooms to this one. Something my adrenaline had made me forget about. It was definitely cold. She and another friend of mine came in and began to scan the room, looking for any disturbances. As they did this, I began to feel a chill run up my spine, and the hair stood up on my arm. The temperature almost seemed to be getting colder, and Kay reflected this as she began to hug herself for warmth. Despite familiar warning signs and rising creep factors that were quickly highlighting my poor decision to hide in this spot, Kay was quickly approaching me, and in mere seconds, I would be smack dab in the center of her line of sight, ending the game and allowing us to leave the room. She stands almost directly in front of the piece of luggage I was crouched behind, and pans her head around the room again. Something was off. Kay hated this room as much as I did, and wasn't about to play a joke, as I knew she wanted to leave it just as much as I did. But despite me being clearly in her view, she was acting like she didn't even see me. She even looked down at me to where we pretty much made eye contact, only for her brow to wrinkle and head to cock to the side like someone would do when they were sure they were right about something, only to be informed they weren't. She let out a, "Huh," and my other friend asked, "Anything?" "No," she replied in a puzzled tone. I stared up at her with a helpless look of confusion on my face as I grew even colder. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, as Kay was neither the type to play pranks, nor a good enough actor to look right at me and not break character. She backed away from me, turned, and began walking towards the door, while still scanning the room and checking behind other items. I sat up in my spot, completely dumbfounded and confused, watching them as I hear a friend in the distance shout, "He's here!" And just like that, Kay flipped the light off and slid the door shut. I was alone in the dark. In the room I feared the most inside my haunted house, and the only people that made me feel safe enough to do such a thing just left. All the while seemingly unaware I was here. It was freezing, and despite having a small window that often illuminated the room, it was still pitch black. Despite being around noon on a sunny summer day, the light that should be coming through the window wasn't making a dent on the darkness. I sat in complete silence for a moment, breathing hard and quietly freaking out. In fact, it was so quiet my ears began to ring. The ringing was broken when I began to hear slight noises and creaks, like someone was shifting their way through the mess of items at random places in the room. I was petrified with fear, and all the hairs on my body stood up straight as I began to get an unusual feeling. Have you ever hid somewhere creepy or dark, but since you were hiding there with someone else, you still felt creeped out, but you also felt safe because someone you knew was behind you? I had that sense. The sense that someone was behind me, hiding with me. I started to feel something touch my back in a way that I could only describe as someone doing the itsy-bitsy spider, with their fingers walking from my lower back to my shoulders. I was too scared to move from where I was because the path to the door was an obstacle course, even with the lights on, and would be a complete disaster with the lights off. I imagined trying to run to the door and being chased down by whatever was behind me and tripping, which was unnerving to say the least. I needed help. I put my hands over my ears and just started to scream, "Help!" at the top of my lungs. I said it over and over and over, as I felt more hands touching my arms, my head, and fingers running through my hair. I kept shouting as loud as I could and began to feel a cold breath right in my ear despite my hand covering it. Still with the ears covered and eyes closed, the touching finally stopped. I then felt someone start rubbing my back in the same consoling way that only my mom did when I would have a bad day or be sad about something. I heard the muffled voice of my mom say, "What's wrong?" I was overjoyed and quickly dropped my hands, lifted my head and opened my eyes to thank my mother for saving me. It was pitch dark. I had it at this point. I was about 5 minutes overdue for an epic noping the fuck out of there. I burst up from my spot and took very short but quick steps towards where I thought the door was. It wasn't graceful by any means, and I knocked over a ton of stuff, but I finally hit the door and slid it open to the family room and slammed the door behind me. The light was on, but it was empty. This was the room that we all gathered in after each game, or even while looking for others, and there generally was at least 1 or 2 people hanging out in here while others were still off searching. I was confused, but I heard voices coming from the rooms on the other side of the basement. I cautiously walked over to the doorway of the spare room, and could see my friends looking in the walk-in closet, my other most hated room in the basement, with their backs to me. Reluctantly, I asked, "What are you guys doing?" They all jumped and looked completely freaked out. I was furious and asked why they left me in the storage room, ignored my screams, and why they were on the other side of the basement. Kay, noticeably weirded out, swore to me that she never saw me, and then explained that she and everyone else started hearing my voice in the spare bedroom closet. Apparently, when they would all pour into the closet to try to find me, they would then start to hear my voice in the office, then the bathroom, then the laundry room. They couldn't figure out how I was evading them, only to lure them to different rooms to then evade them again. I told them I was never in any of those rooms, and had been in the storage room the entire time. Seconds later, we were bursting out of the back door of the house. I told them what happened to me, and Kay felt so bad that she didn't see or help me, that she was almost in tears. Needless to say, we took a break from the game for a while. Sadly, this was just one afternoon in a haunted house that I lived in for 18 years, and events like this were far more common than I'd like to admit. I still, to this day, rarely ever go back into that room. 5. This story is what I like to think of as my first real scary encounter of the paranormal. Previous to this, I had some odd occurrences happen to me, but nothing like this. Everything in this story is true, and although some of it can be explained to the nature of the place, well, some of it cannot be explained. It was the summer after finishing college, about to go to university. I live in England, and the town that I live in is rather small, just outside of a large city. The location that the event took place in was a house a few doors away from my small, semi-rural street. My friend at the time, let's call her Emily, had family friends who owned a house on the street that I live on. The house was a large Victorian villa, painted pink, and faced a large field. One day, Emily texted me saying that she needed to house sit the house, as her family friends were going away. I can't remember exactly why she needed to be in the house to keep an eye on things, but she needed to stay there for a week, Naturally, as I was only a few doors down from this house, she asked if I would like to keep her company for a few nights, watch some films, and have a few drinks. We went out and bought some snacks and went to the house. I remember it was a really warm day, and roughly 5 p.m. when we went to the house. The first thing I noticed was as soon as I had walked into the house, it was so cold. Granted, it was an old house and they are cold, but I remember feeling really cold. The air was completely different from walking outside to inside. We settled down in the house, had a look around the place, and made some food. Everything is calm and nothing occurred for the first few hours we were there. We watched things on TV and had a gossip, the usual stuff. It got dark and I remember seeing sun setting over the large field outside of the house. Once the sun had gone down, that's when things started to get weird. The first thing I noticed was the floorboards creaking above us. At first I thought, being that it was an old house and being a warm day, it was just natural noises coming from the wood as it got cooler. But it seemed to be constant. After an hour or so, we both noticed how weird it was. It was almost like someone was upstairs walking around. We did have a panic, and went to the foot of the staircase and listened out for anything. I remember then being really spooked. It was dark as well, as the light bulb for the downstairs had broken, so we had no light apart from the light from the living room we had just come from. We stood there for a minute after, but then returned to the living room and carried on watching the TV. Still feeling a bit spooked, and at that point I was freezing cold. I got a blanket and curled up on the sofa. A few hours passed and we found a film to watch on the TV. I forget what it was. At this point it was pitch black outside and we had all the lights on in the house because we were feeling a bit spooked. I remember seeing lights at the corner of my eye a lot, as if something was running in and out of the kitchen door. Time went on and we watched the film until I got this terrible feeling. It was horrible. Like a cold hand was poking my back, and I had shivers down my spine. I think Emily felt the same as well because we both looked at each other, spooked. We were both under a blanket at this point. I was on one side of the sofa and Emily on the other, watching the film on TV, trying to forget what had happened. But roughly 10 minutes later, something really strange happened. I would like to firstly point out that the lights in the living room were the usual switch on off sort of thing, but as we sat there, the lights all gradually dimmed until they completely went out. We both freaked. Emily jumped right over to my side of the sofa and we were both speechless. I remember feeling so scared that I wanted to cry. After 10, maybe 15 minutes of being freaked out, I got the courage to go try the lights to see if maybe they had just blown out in a weird way. But to my surprise, the lights just turned on as normal. It sent shivers down my spine. At this point, it was really late, and we both decided to try and sleep. We walked to the staircase, and I remembered us both stood at the bottom, looking up, thinking how we will get into bed without freaking ourselves out. We both ran as fast as we could up the stairs, and ran into the rooms we were going to sleep in. I was staying in a small guest bedroom, which was next to the bathroom, and on the other side of the house, Emily slept in the master bedroom. I got into bed, threw the covers over myself, and hoped that I would fall asleep. That didn't happen. I was dying to use the toilet, but I was so scared to leave the bedroom. After an hour, I decided I would run into the bathroom, do my business, and run back to bed. I got on the toilet and sat there for a moment. As I did, I noticed everything was really cold. I had a really horrible feeling about the bathroom and just wanted to do my business and get out. As I sat there, I noticed there were shadows darting around the bathroom. I froze in shock. and wanted to run out as soon as I could. I looked through the doorway, and it looks as though there was someone stood the other side of the door. You know, like the shadow you get if there is a light on outside a door. Problem was, there wasn't a light on outside the door. It was weird. I jumped off the toilet and ran into the bedroom I was sleeping in and threw myself under the covers, hoping for sleep. A few hours passed, and I didn't sleep a wink. I didn't dare look over my covers in case I saw anything, which would freak me out. By now it must have been 4 a.m. and the faint sound of birds singing was in the air. It brought some comfort, and I relaxed a little. At this point I decided to look over my covers and around the room. Nothing there. I was thankful and looked around the room some more. I even looked out the window, looking for some light in the night sky. But then I turned around and noticed a really old TV in the room, which I didn't really notice much earlier. It had a strange glow to it. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks, and then realized that those old TVs sometimes give off a faint glow when they're turned off, but plugged in. Feeling cocky, I got out of bed to unplug the TV, as not to freak myself out anymore. I froze when I realized the TV wasn't plugged into the wall, and worst of all, the wire had been cut completely in half. My eyes widened, and I ran into bed freaked out. I peered over the covers once again, and saw that the TV still had the glow, but now it had what seemed like hands, running over the weird static-like glow on the screen. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I swear that night lasted a lifetime. It eventually was morning, and I had not slept at all. Being late, I went downstairs because, nothing bad ever happens in the daytime. I sat in the kitchen and lit a cigarette. I promised myself I would never step into this house again. Emily eventually woke up, and I got out of the house as soon as I could. I slept all day at home. It was bliss. No creepy house to think about or anything. That was until I got a phone call. Emily calling to ask if I could come over again to the house. I saying how tired I was, how I couldn't because of how freaked I was, but somehow she convinced me to come over again. I told her that I would, but only if I could stay in the same room as her. So I went back over. I hated the feeling of walking around that house. Emily greeted me at the door and we settled in for the night, watching more films, trying to forget everything in the house which made it creepy as hell. Apparently, Emily had not had anything odd or weird happen to her at all last night. The night was very uneventful. Nothing happened. Just the odd creak here and there, but nothing else. It put my mind at rest and I relaxed a little. We called it a night at around 12 a.m. and went to bed. As I agreed, I didn't want to stay in the guest room again, so I stayed in the master bedroom, in the large double bed with Emily. I fell asleep pretty quickly, and had a good rest. That was until I woke up in the night. Not sure on the time, but it was still dark out. I slept next to a large walk-in wardrobe, with the door next to the bed. I remember it had been closed when I had gone to bed, but when I woke up, it was slightly open. I looked and thought, weird, but didn't think anything odd about it. I closed my eyes again, opened them, and it was slightly more open. What the fuck? Am I dreaming or something? It was still a night with no wind at all, so what was opening this door? I started to freak again and put the covers over my head, not wanting to see anything. I had been like this for a few moments when I saw a pink light run across the ceiling. So bright, I could see it from under the covers. I look out for a moment, thinking it could be a car outside, but this wasn't like anything from a car. It looked like someone had a laser printer and was going over the ceiling. The curtains were closed, so it couldn't have been anyone from outside. It was odd, but weirdly comforting. I heard a creak and noticed the door to the wardrobe open a bit more. My eyes widened, and I looked around to see this light going crazy. Then the door slowly closed again. I didn't know how to feel. I lay back down and somehow fell asleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but I woke up again, still dark out. But I was laughing. And Emily was laughing. Not a sort of a laugh, but a hysterical sort of laugh. When I came to my senses, I noticed I was jiggling something. I looked down to my arms, and I had both of my hands on Emily's breasts, and I was juggling them up and down as we both laughed. I freaked out and stopped. I was so confused, and didn't know how this happened. I tried to talk to Emily, saying sorry for what happened, but she was fast asleep. What the fuck just happened? I was awake. I know I didn't do this on purpose. Something happened in my sleep. I can't explain it. Morning soon arrived, and I had slept till late. We both had. I knew from then that I did not or could not stay around this house anymore. I said my goodbyes and went home. I never returned to that house again. Emily went on to stay in the house for a few more nights with her brother, but she never mentioned anything odd happening. I still live around the corner from that house, and whenever I walk past the house, I still get a shiver down my spine. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to this all paranormal subscribers video. I'm sorry if you don't like the paranormal videos, but I had a lot of them this week, so it just kind of accidentally ended up being all paranormal. Big thanks go to all the individuals who sent me their stories in, allowed me to use them. Thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank you all for the very kind feedback you've left on my most recent videos, especially the Q&A. I was very nervous about putting that up, and also quite lazy, that's why it took me so long to do it, but mostly nervous, so it felt really nice, seeing how positive and pleasant everyone was. Incidentally, the Q&A's up if you haven't seen it, so if you get a spare half hour, go check that out. Although I must say, if you don't like the rambly bits like this at the end of my videos, you're probably not going to enjoy the Q&A because it's almost 30 minutes of that. And with those words, I'm going to leave you for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.